Maeve, Queen of Connacht, villain of Ireland's Ulster cycle, and someone who rivals Cu Chulainn for being the lewdest character in Fate. But what about the Queen Maeve of Fate Grand Order? How well does she compare to her mythical counterpart? And what grade would I give her depiction? Let's get into it. So, fair warning, Irish names are hard. I'm going to try to get these right, but they don't make it easy, especially once you factor in regional accents and such that change the various pronunciations quite a bit. Please don't kill me if I screw up, thanks. Maeve is a rider class servant, which, well, this is certainly an interesting one, because in her first interlude, Maeve tells you exactly what kind of rider she is. She's not shy about it either, going into quite a bit of detail as to what exactly she rides, how much she likes doing it, and even preferences for the temperament of what she is riding. Credit for not being shy about all that, but did you really have to say all of that in front of MASH? Anyway, is any of this actually fitting for the Queen Maeve of Myth? Short answer, yes. Maeve was infamous for the number of affairs she carried out. She would tell those who pursued her that they needed to have 3 things: that they have no fear, that they not be mean, and that they not be jealous. That last one in particular is very important. I'll be getting into detail later once I get into her backstory, but the gist is that Maeve shagged everybody, and everybody wanted to shag her. Well, one guy didn't, but we'll get into that later. Now all of that is very lewd, and hilarious, but does Maeve have any potential for the rider class aside from riding, sticks? As a matter of fact, she does. Maeve wasn't just a sex goddess. She was also a warrior queen who accompanied her armies into battle. And how did she do so? Well, she rode a chariot, and was said to carry both a sword and a spear. Indeed, she would be buried with her sword, spear, and shield. Perhaps that's why Maeve's summer version is a saber. Anyway, I think I've settled this one. Maeve does qualify for the rider class, and not just because she is a rider of eggplants. Getting into her character design, Maeve looks a bit different from her usual depictions. Typically how Queen Maeve is portrayed outside of Fate is as a warrior queen, often sitting upon a throne, and usually with some weapons nearby. Fate goes in a very different direction, giving her this white outfit that, bit by bit, has parts removed as you move up her ascensions. First you have this fur coat, which might be useful I suppose. Ireland doesn't have a hot climate, but it's not exactly freezing either. Hopefully that coat is rainproof. She tosses off the coat for her second ascension, giving us something fancy that the illustrator equates to a white female knight. Maeve was a queen rather than a knight, but as far as her main ascensions go, this is probably the best of them, though that's not exactly a high bar. Another new element is the whip or riding crop she is holding, which, do I really have to talk about this? I'm not an expert on these things, but that looks rather... Anyway, her third ascension, she tosses more clothes off, now basically wearing lingerie. The illustrator mentions that, yes, while this is meant to look like sexy underwear, it is also meant to give a pro-wrestling vibe, as in this being something Maeve might wear while throwing down in the ring. I don't follow wrestling, but a quick image search tells me that female wrestlers don't dress like this, though perhaps you could argue that Maeve is into a different kind of wrestling. Maeve also has a few costumes, of course. Kinoko Nasu has gone on record saying Maeve is one of his favorite characters, so this shouldn't be a surprise. Her first costume comes from Summer 2, where she acts as a prison warden, but based on the costume, the kind of things Maeve gets up to, and that lewd-looking whip, just what kind of prison warden is she? I mean, Maeve does have a rather domineering personality, so her dressed up like she runs a sex dungeon at least makes some sense. By contrast, her second costume from the Grail Live event looks much more like her normal ascensions, a fancy white dress she wears as part of her new career as an idol. Like the rest of her designs, it is a departure from the warrior queen image, but it's not completely crazy. You could argue she was something like an idol when she was Queen of Connacht, a revered queen who was respected by her people, feared by her enemies, and certainly someone people would be interested in. Lastly, you have her Lost Belt version, which in my opinion is by far the best of Maeve's designs, portraying her as a formidable ruler without losing her attractive appearance. Overall, I'm not a fan of Maeve's design. She does have a glamorous vibe, and while she was adored and lusted after, Maeve was much more than that. She was a warrior queen, one who accompanied her armies into battle. In my opinion, Maeve should look more like the capable ruler of the myths rather than an idol, stripper, dominatrix, or whatever else this is supposed to be. Moving into her skill set, Maeve's first skill is Golden Rule Body, which becomes Queen's Figure after an upgrade. This skill grants debuff immunity for 3 turns, HP regen each turn for 3 turns, and MP gain each turn for 3 turns. The upgrade also allows Maeve to give an MP charge to all male or fairy allies. Golden Rule Body is a variation of the skill Golden Rule, where someone is gifted with exquisite beauty that, no matter what, will never be tarnished. At the moment, only Maeve and Leonardo da Vinci have this skill, though Cleopatra does have a variation of it that also factors in her skill with money. Since Maeve was basically a sex goddess, this makes sense, as does the upgrade name of Queen's figure since she was a queen. However, this is a good opportunity to talk about something else. In FGO, Maeve is said to have fairy ancestry, and her Lost Belt version actually is a fairy. Now, the Queen Maeve of legend did not have fairy blood, but there are theories that Maeve is the inspiration for the character of Queen Mab, a fairy queen connected to Merlin, who is mentioned in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and appears in many other works as well. This is also the name of Noctarib's predecessor in Lost Belt 6. So while Maeve herself might not be a fairy, she might have been the basis for a fairy queen character in later stories. Maeve's second skill is Charisma, which turns into Queen's Discipline after an upgrade. Charisma is the usual 3-turn attack buff, while Queen's Discipline adds a self-heal and an additional 3-turn attack buff for all male allies. Charisma is a generic skill we often see on leaders, and that does fit Maeve. While we joke about why she qualifies as a rider, Maeve was also a powerful queen who commanded significant respect. Yes, she was narcissistic, selfish, and a terror to her enemies, but to her own people, she was wise, admired, and led her own armies in the field. Charisma, and this specialized version of the skill specific to Maeve, are both skills that she deserves to have. Lastly, Maeve's third skill is Siren Song, which becomes Intoxicating Mead after an upgrade. Siren Song allows her to charm a single male enemy for a turn, while Intoxicating Mead also reduces that enemy's defense for a turn, regardless of its gender. Siren Song is a generic skill where someone uses their singing voice to charm someone. It's a skill we saw on Phantom and will later see on the 2 elder Gorgon sisters. Now Maeve has this skill at rank C, and I've never heard of her doing any singing. I think she just got this skill because it allows her to charm men, which she very much is known for. However, this all changes when the skill is upgraded to Intoxicating Mead. The name Maeve comes from the old Celtic word for mead, the alcoholic drink, and her name literally means one who intoxicates. And since Maeve is well known for being alluring, men are literally willing to die for a chance to be with her, I think this skill's connection to Maeve's legend couldn't be any clearer. It's also worth noting that Maeve has a second MP called My Red Mead, which is discussed in the interlude which gives you this skill upgrade, so you could say that this skill also represents that.
あらゆる力が私の力。人を滑る王権、人を虐げる皇帝、人を震わす恐怖、チャリオット・マイラブ。
Queen Maeve's noble phantasm is Chariot My Love, whereupon she declares her authority, hops onto her chariot, and then proceeds to do things with the enemy in question. This MP does heavy damage to a single enemy, with extra damage against male enemies, as well as decreased mental debuff resistance for 3 turns, those latter 2 effects depending upon overcharge. So with the possible exception of Sessue and Kiara's MP from Fate Extra CCC, this might be the lewdest noble phantasm we have in Fate. I mean, she is literally shagging someone to death. Now I've already said plenty about Maeve's exploits, and I'll be saying more about them later too. So let's talk about the bulls pulling her chariot instead. This is a very clear reference to arguably the most famous story about Queen Maeve, the Tanbo Kunya, also known as the cattle raid of Cooley, which is what I'm going to call it from now on because that is way easier to say. Well, it's not just about Maeve. This story is going to come up again in at least 2 other future videos, since it's probably the most famous story in Irish legend. Much of the story and its conflict centers around 2 bulls, Finnbanach, a bull owned by Maeve's husband Aliel, and Don Cunya, a bull owned by a vassal of Maeve's first husband Conovar, King of Ulster. As for the details of that story, we will get to them in a bit. Maeve's craft essence is Sacred Spring, depicting a small pond in a forest with some neat swirls in the water. So what's going on here? Well, the C's text honestly doesn't tell you very much. Most of it is just Maeve telling you how awesome she is, how everything belongs to her, and that, rather than the Holy Grail, you should desire her instead. Seriously, she sounds like Gilgamesh. But why show a pond? The C's text might not say it, but this has a close connection to Maeve's story, specifically how it ends. How did Maeve die? Well, it was her routine to take a bath every day, but Maeve had made quite a few enemies in her life, and one day, an old grudge would come back to bite her. Maeve had killed one of her sisters, Clora, who had been pregnant with the child of her hated first husband, Conovar, King of Ulster. The child ended up surviving, though, being born after his mother's death. Many years later, this child, a son named Furbade, decided to take revenge, ambushing Maeve and killing her by using his sling. Now some stories say that he hit her with a rock, but much more memorably, other stories instead say that it was a piece of cheese. In other words, Maeve suffered death by cheese at the hands of her nephew while taking a bath. As far as deaths go, that's a pretty memorable one. No wonder why she has become so hypersensitive about cheese since she became a servant, and why, if you look at some of her attack animations, she is actually kicking cheese thrown at her, redirecting them to hit her enemies instead. Maeve's Valentine CE is Maeve's Honey Chocolate, depicting a bottle of honey chocolate. As far as Valentine's gifts go, this one is pretty straightforward. I mentioned before that Maeve's name is related to the old Celtic word for mead, an alcoholic beverage. And mead is made from honey, so we get honey chocolate. I already talked about this in connection with her third skill, so I see little reason to rehash it here. One thing though, it's mentioned in the CE text that she gives a bottle of this not only to you, but to Cu Chulainn and Fergus as well, two characters who play major parts in Maeve's story. And speaking of that, let's move along and take a look at the backstory of Maeve, Queen of Connacht. First, some general information. The time frame for when exactly Maeve is said to have lived is rather vague, but the stories depict a pre-Christian Ireland full of many deities. When the legends were written down between the 12th and 15th centuries, they made the Ulster Cycle, the collection of stories that feature Maeve and many others, take place around the middle and end of the 1st century BCE, roughly during the time of Caesar and Cleopatra. As far as location goes, Connacht is the western province of the 4 provinces of Ireland. Ulster, the province this cycle is named after and where much of this story will take place, is the northern province. While we may not know when exactly, it's possible that there really was a Queen Maeve in Irish history, but living in a time before written records were kept, and so proving her existence is rather difficult. Maeve was the daughter of Eohud's Fedlec, the High King of Ireland, one of 6 daughters and 4 sons. Her first appearance in the legends is when she is married to the King of Ulster, Conovar mac Nessa. High King Eohud had killed the previous High King in battle, and he had apparently been the father of Conovar, and so he wed his daughter to Conovar to try to make up for that. This, however, would not prove to be a happy marriage. Maeve and Conovar would have a son, but she soon left him. Not long after this first marriage collapsed, her father deposed the King of Connacht, Tini mac Conry, and offered the throne to Maeve, a position she accepted. But in this case, deposed didn't mean murdered. King Tini was still alive, and in order to ensure that the start of her reign would be peaceful, Maeve decided to shag the former king and invite him back. And so former King Tini got his throne back. Kinda. But it was also around this time that Maeve decided to murder her sister, Clora, who had married Conovar and was carrying his child. Conovar's response was to assault Maeve while she was taking a bath, provoking Tini to challenge Conovar to a duel he would lose. Now, while you could argue that Conovar might have been justified to take some kind of revenge against Maeve for murdering his wife, 1. Sexual assault is absolutely not an acceptable way to do it, and 2nd, this doesn't change the fact that Conovar is a terrible person. I'll get into detail about this in my future video on him, but, short version, Conovar murders the son of Fergus in a pretty foul way, leading to Fergus defecting to Maeve and her kingdom, where he would become pretty much the only person who could actually sate Maeve's desires. With Tini dead, Maeve would end up having to find someone else to be her second husband. She chose Eohud's Dala, who had been a rival to Tini for the throne of Connacht. But this marriage wouldn't last long, since after discovering that Maeve had started an affair with the captain of her bodyguards, Ailill mac Mate, King Eohud would challenge Ailill to a duel and lose, getting himself killed. Ailill would then become Maeve's third husband, and this time it would actually last. The two would have 8 children, 7 sons and a daughter. Originally, all of these sons had different names, but one day Maeve met a druid and asked him which of her sons would kill Conovar. Upon being told that it was her son Mane, and since she didn't have a son named Mane, Maeve then renamed all 7 of her sons Mane. And as it turned out, one of her sons would indeed kill Conovar, a completely different Conovar than the one Maeve had been thinking of. Despite seeming to have a long and happy marriage, Maeve and Ailill would get into an argument that would have some major consequences. Basically, Maeve and Ailill had the exact same amount of personal wealth, except Ailill had this prized bull named Fimbinach. Maeve, never wanting to be inferior in any way, immediately sought to find another prize bull that would allow her to be richer than her husband. The only bull that qualified was Don Cunha, and since this bull was owned by a vassal of her hated ex-husband, King Conovar of Ulster, all the better. and so began what became known as the Cattle Raid of Cooley, where Queen Maeve marched together with her armies to seize this prize bull so that she could be richer than her husband. The timing was chosen well. There was a curse put upon the warriors of Ulster that they would be unable to fight for 9 days each year. This meant that in all the kingdom of Ulster, none of its native warriors, not even King Connacht, could resist Maeve's armies. She marched in without resistance, confident that it was only a matter of time before she took the bull Don Cunha. But then she started losing soldiers. A lot of soldiers. Despite the fact that all of the Ulster-born men were incapacitated, among their forces was one man who was not actually born in Ulster, and so was immune to the curse. Day after day, Maeve's army was taking hundreds of casualties, all to this lone warrior. After a few days of this, an agreement was reached where Maeve would send a champion to fight this warrior, and that until that warrior was defeated, her armies would not advance further. It was at this point that Maeve got to see the face of this warrior who had been causing her all this trouble, and what she saw shocked her. It was a 17-year-old boy, short, clean-shaven, and quite attractive, hardly what she expected when she heard of the demon that had been savaging her armies. But appearances were deceiving. This boy was a demigod, the son of the god Blue, nephew of King Connacht of Ulster. His birth name had been Setanta, but after an incident involving a guard dog, he was given a new name, Cu Chulainn. Obviously this guy, the original Lancer of the Fate franchise, is going to get his own video someday, probably with the release of the Lilum Harlot event on NA. A succession of duels followed, with Maeve promising the hand of her daughter Finavir, as well as her own friendly thighs, to whoever could defeat Cu Chulainn. But her champions kept falling, with only Fergus managing to get Cu Chulainn to stand down for a day, and that was only because neither foster father nor foster son wanted to fight each other. One enemy Cu Chulainn had to face was Clan Calatin, a monster consisting of a father and his 27 sons fused into one body wielding poisoned weapons. We later would see the concept of this monster used to help summon 28 demon gods at the end of the America Singularity. Maeve's final champion was Ferdiad, Cu Chulainn's foster brother. The two would fight over 3 days, and while Cu Chulainn did win, he was left wounded and needed time to recover. This allowed Maeve to advance, but by then Cu Chulainn had accomplished his mission. He had delayed Maeve's army long enough for the Ulster warriors to start entering the fray, the curse having finished its duration. Before long, Maeve's army was forced to retreat back to Connacht, and though she did manage to capture the bull Don Cunha, as soon as she brought it back home, it got into a fight with her husband's bull, resulting in the death of both. So after all of that, in this great quest to try to surpass her husband's wealth, both Maeve and her husband ended up poorer as a result. Again, I'm going to revisit this story in later videos, particularly the one on Cu Chulainn. That's when I'll get into more detail about all the duels and such. Maeve would get her revenge later, working behind the scenes in a plot together with the sons of numerous warriors Cu Chulainn had killed to finally bring him down. Conflict then arose between Maeve and her husband Ailill again, this time over her relationship with Fergus. Though they had agreed that there would be no jealousy between them when they married, when Ailill saw Maeve and Fergus together in a lake, jealousy overcame him and he had his brother throw a spear at the pair, killing Fergus. Maeve in turn would get Cu Chulainn's foster brother Conall Cernach, who was angry about the murder of Fergus, to kill her husband for her, which he would do, though Conall would be killed trying to escape. Then finally came Maeve's own death, the incident I described in her craft instance where the son of her sister Clora hit her with some cheese while she was taking a bath. According to legend, Maeve is buried upright in a cairn at the top of a hill in Connacht. That hill's name is Knocknarib, the name of Maeve's lost belt counterpart in Avalon Le Fay. Moving into Fate Grand Order, we first meet Maeve in the 5th Singularity, E Pluribus Unum, or the America Singularity. In this story, Maeve is the main antagonist, using the Grail to create an ideal version of Cu Chulainn as her king, then working together to conquer the United States in 1783. Now I have a lot of things to say about this singularity, the weird premise, how full of anachronisms it is, and that stupid Prezi King shit, but I'm going to set that aside for a future video. Maeve creates this alter version of Cu Chulainn to satisfy both her ambitions and her desires. After all, it is said in story that Cu Chulainn is one of the few warriors who spurned Maeve, refusing to do some riding together, and that it was for that reason that Maeve had him killed. Except, that's just not true. In the Cattle Raid of Cooley, where Cu Chulainn holds up Maeve's armies long enough for the Ulster armies to awaken from the curse and defeat her in the field, as well as a few side stories I glossed over, it is never mentioned that Maeve tried to go riding with Cu Chulainn or had any interest in doing so. I just can't find it. Her decision to have him killed was pretty much the same as it was for the various men she conspired with. They had lost someone or been humiliated by Cu Chulainn, and so wanted revenge. While there is no doubt a connection between Maeve and Cu Chulainn, and that the normal versions of Cu Chulainn try to avoid Maeve, it didn't have anything to do with any lewd desires. Still, I can't completely blame the writers for adding this. We've talked about Maeve basically being a sex goddess already, and Cu Chulainn was no slouch in that department either. Actually, the reason why he attacked Maeve's armies only after she had already marched into Ulster was because he wasn't watching the border. He was preoccupied, you could say. Yet despite being similar in this regard, there is no evidence that Maeve was interested in shacking up with Cu Chulainn. Though her wanting him as a partner to conquer America, that does make sense at least. He was the strongest warrior of the Ulster cycle, and she was its most powerful queen. Together, the two of them would make a deadly pair, as proved during the America Singularity. Another trait that Maeve regularly expresses is pride, or ego, or vanity, whatever you want to call it. This does have a clear link to the myth, since Maeve was a proud queen who sought to be superior to all others, to demonstrate that fact, and to react harshly when it was threatened or denied. The whole story of the cattle raid of Cooley makes that quite clear. It literally began because Maeve wanted to be wealthier than her husband. This prideful and domineering attitude crops up pretty much whenever Maeve appears on screen in FGO. What is less often seen, however, is that behind all of that pride is some genuine intelligence. It's not just about being an attractive queen, but also being a ruler worthy of respect and admiration. But, more often than not in FGO, Maeve tends to display her arrogance far more often than the talents that cause her to be so confident. The qualities that actually made Maeve a good ruler her people adored and her enemies feared. There is one story that is an exception to this, though, where we get to see Maeve's real potential, and that is Lost Belt 6, Avalon the Fae. The Lost Belt version of Maeve, Noctarib, is the young ruler of the King clan who is trying to take the throne from Morgan, so she hasn't actually become a queen yet. She also has yet to become a sex goddess, with this version of Maeve saying that she plans to pursue such interests only after taking the throne. Lost Belt Maeve is instead depicted as a fairly competent warlord who is probably the only other realistic candidate to rule Fairy Britain aside from Morgan. Even if much of it is a comedy chapter, this is made quite clear when your party visits her capital in Edinburgh. The city is well run, her armies are formidable, and she is well respected by her people. Of course, since this is Lost Belt 6, everything goes to hell later on, but that had more to do with the vicious whims of the Fae rather than anything to do with Lost Belt Maeve. She's still prideful and somewhat difficult to deal with, but compared to her proper history counterpart, we at least see more of why Queen Maeve has the reputation she does, that of a formidable ruler who you really don't want to mess with. And now for the verdict. What grade would I give Queen Maeve's depiction in Fate Grand Order? Well, her character design and skill set are mixed, perhaps leaning a bit too much into Maeve's reputation for going on rides. Her design to me is less warrior queen and more like a stripper who moonlights as a dominatrix. But at least her actual skills, MP, and craft essences closely connect with her legends. As for characterization, this too is a bit mixed. On the one hand, portraying Maeve as a haughty, sultry, aggressive queen is true to her character. And while giving her an obsession with Cu Chulainn is itself not too weird, making it out to be because Maeve wanted him but never got him, I can't find that anywhere in the original myths. He was just an enemy who inflicted a humiliating defeat upon her, and that is why she had him killed. But while FGO's Maeve displays many of her negative qualities, she doesn't often show her more positive aspects, that of a wise, fair queen who inspired her allies and intimidated her enemies. We see more of that Maeve in her Lost Belt version, where she is portrayed as a menace to Morgan's kingdom right up until its collapse. The funny thing is, if you were to combine FGO's proper history Maeve with her Lost Belt counterpart, that would actually be a really good portrayal of the Queen Maeve of Irish legend. But since we instead have them split into two different characters, we get two weaker Maeves rather than one genuinely good one. Now as far as grades go, we have an interesting situation here in that there is both proper history and Lost Belt Maeve. Usually we only see one version of the character, or to have a Lost Belt version that is their own unique character with only a few connections to the original. For proper history Maeve, Queen of Connacht, I would give her a D+. Her Lost Belt version, Noctarib, is much better, getting a B-. But if these two characters had had their personalities combined while having Lost Belt Maeve's design, I'd be willing to give that hypothetical character an A. Sadly though, that character does not exist in FGO, and probably never will. If you would like to learn more about another character who does a lot of writing, check out my video on Heracles here. Until next time.